We Protestants don't use a lot of Latin terminology. We do sing something called the Gloria Patri, Latin for glory be to the Father. And then there's the famous set of what we call the five solas: sola scriptura, sola fide, sola gratia, sola Christus, and soli Deo gloria. Scripture alone, faith alone, grace alone, Christ alone, and only to God be the glory. But there is one Latin term that is worth having in our theological vocabulary: Imago Dei. Hello, I'm Stuart Baskin, pastor of First Presbyterian Church of Tyler, Texas, and this is your daily devotional for Saturday, September 9th, 2023. Imago Dei simply means image of God. In theological terms, it refers directly to Genesis 1 and the creation of humankind. You'll recall that in the first account of the creation, the more liturgical, poetic account in Genesis 1, God creates living creatures, culminating with humankind. The description of the creation of humankind is especially striking. We read, "Then God said, let us make humankind in our image, according to our likeness, and let them have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the birds of the air, and over the cattle, and over all the wild animals of the earth, and over every creeping thing that creeps upon the earth." So God created humankind in his image. In the image of God he created them. Male and female he created them. Dissertations and major theological works have been written on the meaning of the Imago Dei, so clearly we cannot plumb the depths of it here in the course of just a couple of minutes. So instead, let me just make a few observations for us to chew on. First, notice that this passage precedes the account of the fall, which we find in Genesis 3. What that means is that humankind originally bore the image of God. Originally. Throughout the history of the faith, there has been a lot of debate about whether the image of God was completely defaced in us by sin or simply distorted. The Scots Confession, for example, says, "By this transgression, generally known as original sin, the image of God was utterly defaced in man, and he and his children became by nature hostile to God, slaves to Satan, and servants to sin." Ouch. But not everyone agrees with that completely. I think there would be a pretty strong consensus across the traditions that while sin certainly obscures the image of God within us, it does not completely erase it. Second, the term image is significant here, especially in light of yesterday's discussion of idolatry. Recall that idolatry, at least initially, has to do with making statues or images of other gods and then worshiping them. So it's striking that the author of this particular account uses the very term image, which in other places refers to statues of other gods. The way the term was often used in the ancient world, an image was a physical depiction of a god, signifying the god's presence. In other words, wherever there was an image of a god, usually a statue, that god was understood to be truly present. But the Hebrew God was never really understood to be confined to a particular place, and certainly not to any physical depiction. Instead, it is humankind, by the way, both male and female, who are in the image of God. This is incredibly important. It signifies that alone among creatures, human beings bear the imprint of God. It is usually depicted as being the presence of an immortal soul within us, and just as an image of a God signified a God's actual presence, so human beings are the image of God who represent God's actual presence in the world. Third, the Apostle Paul occasionally refers to the image of God in a variety of ways, but throughout his letters he pretty consistently talks about us being conformed to the image of God through Jesus Christ, who himself is the perfect image of God. Thus, to the extent that the image of God in us has been marred or distorted, the image of God is being restored in us through Jesus Christ. Finally, to be created in the image of God is more than simply an honor. It lays upon us an obligation. Two, actually. First, it lays upon us the obligation to treat one another with a certain kind of reverence. Not the same reverence we owe to God, of course, But since we are all alike made in the image of God, we have the obligation to regard each other as God's property. Second, it means that as God's image within the created order, we have an obligation to care for the creation, which actually belongs to God. Strictly speaking, we live on God's property. We're just caretakers. Imago Dei may not be the most familiar term to many of us, but it is worth knowing, for we are indeed, all of us, made in the image of God. When we return next week, we'll continue with our discussion of important theological terms to know. But for now, may God continue to bless you and keep you in all that you do, this day and in all the days ahead.